Appreciate it. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how engineers are risk reduction agents. Basically, most of us are involved in finding ways to after we assess the risk, we become risk managers, risk reducers. So thought it'd be a good idea to maybe talk about the cascade of how we get to risk and reliability. First step is hazard. So everybody has their own concept of what a hazard is. Engineers have kind of a special definition of hazard, where they apply their factors of safety and so forth. For environmental engineers, environmental scientists, hazard is generally an inherent term, and I'll talk about it in a bit. Exposure is the second part of risk. So you can have something that's very inherently hazardous, but if you're not exposed to it, you have zero risk. Risk and reliability are inversely related to each other. And then resilience is something that's gotten a lot more attention the past couple of decades than it did. But you need to have a system that's robust and resilient. Ultimately, that leads to a sustainable approach. So I know last session you guys talked about ethics, so I won't bore you with a lot of ethics stuff, even though that's what I do a lot of. And ultimately, the justice. So Arnie Desmond and I wrote a book a long time ago on socially responsible engineering, where it's basically it's all about justice and how engineers are, again, agents of justice. So hazard, as I mentioned, you have to identify the hazard first. So a lot of my work is on pollutants. So pollutants that you could have something like sulfur dioxide that has a threshold where it's not hazardous below a certain level. Then you have some that are like carcinogens and so forth, where we really don't have a safe level. So that's in the literature, you'll see things like no threshold and threshold. So a substance that has a threshold means below a certain level, it's no longer hazardous. But at the dose is no longer hazardous. At a carcinogen, generally, we never say it's not hazardous. So, and that's almost by definition. The way we determine that, and I'll talk a little bit about dose response. You have a negative response to something. Dose response came out of the pharmaceutical literature, which they actually wanted a response. So if you had a headache, you wanted the aspirin basically to have an effect, have a response that your headache is actually dissipating. And as I mentioned, it's an inherent property. Exposure, you can't have exposure without contact. So there's a whole literature of exposure science that looks at really three things: the concentration, the magnitude of the exposure, and the duration of the exposure. So there's a time function, there's a mass function, and then there's a concentration function. Risk is the likelihood of some kind of harm, some adverse outcome. So it is, we talk a lot about the acceptability of risk. So engineers have to operate between some kind of optimal range of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. So there's a lot of tools out there. You'll see this is a decision framework where you put a lot of factors in and you say, okay, if I do this, I'm going to have less of the substance, but it costs me so much. It'd be almost like a good example would be, if you really wanted nobody to die on a highway, you would have a 1 mile an hour speed limit, right? So we have to actually compensate for other values. So kind of it's a valuation type thing. So not just monetary valuation, but any kind of valuation. There's also in the chemical and the biological agents that are harmful. There's something called ALARP, which came out of Europe and United Kingdom specifically, which is the risk. You have to look at risk in a function as what is intolerable, what's tolerable if you do the right things, and what is just basically you don't worry about. So, and that really includes everything. So, every substance that you look at, every microbe that you look at falls somewhere on this inverted pyramid. Then there's reliability. As I mentioned, it's the risk and reliability are functions that are directly related to each other. The more risk you have that you haven't taken care of, the less reliable your system is. And as you probably all know better than I do, risk is an expression of capability, efficiency, and availability of the system. That's what engineers do. So, and we use this RAMS acronym. It has to be reliable, has to be available, has to be maintainable, and it has to be safe. Now, if you actually look at the code of ethics for the ASCE and really all engineering disciplines, safety is the major driver. So, so risk and reliability, as risk increases, reliability decreases, and vice versa. So resilience, as I mentioned, has become an important aspect of engineering. Resiliency engineering drives my son crazy when people call resiliency. Resilience engineering, which is basically something, it's basically hysteresis. So how does something return to and recover to the state that it was in that was acceptable? So when you basically have an assault on a system, and it has both an engineering and an ecological connotation to it, because we can design a system that's robust, that can withstand a lot of input. Ecological, we really kind of inherit that system. So ecological resilience would be, okay, maybe I shouldn't do something in a wetland because it's not going to be resilient. It's really hard to get a wetland once you've assaulted it to return to its acceptable state. Although we have been. Oh, okay. Oh, it's back up. Okay, sorry about that. How long has it been blank? I guess I should turn around and look once in a while. No, my bad. So you want the system to return to a state that's acceptable. Now we have been, some of you are probably involved with reconstructed wetlands or newly constructed wetlands. So we have, when I first started in the 70s looking at wetlands, we said you lose a wetland, it's lost forever. Well, engineers have kind of helped solve that problem a little bit. So your ability to actually withstand and return to an acceptable state is what is all about resilience. Then there's sustainability. It's one of those terms that's really loaded and has a lot of political and ideological connotations to it. When I talk about sustainability, I'm really kind of talking about the response to persistence. So problems are persistent. So we're talking about time. Okay, so everything I just talked about with risk, reliability, resilience, it all applies to sustainability. To have a sustainable system, it has to work, and it has to work into the future. It has to operate within an optimal range within a system. So if you look at a reliability plot, for example, you'll see the famous bathtub curves. We have early failures, late failures, and then you have that optimal range in time where it's when you design a system, it needs to work in those systems for a designed time. For something to be sustainable, you need to stretch out that optimal period. And it is a response, so it does have both a space and a time component to it. So in other words, I want something, I don't want children to get cancer 100 years from now, right? So I want a system that's basically in response to a very long optimal period, as opposed to, I want an air pollution control device that operates for 6 months, because it's relatively cheap and it works well, and I can replace it fairly often and with minimal cost. So the problem we're dealing with, and it's not just environmental engineering, but that's what I know a little bit more about, is that they persist. So if I have PFAS, which I'm sure you guys all have to deal with these days, they're called forever chemicals. So my optimal period has to be really long to deal with them. So one of the ways you deal with them is you have standards and so forth. So standards, so the actions that you take to deal with the problem have to be sustained, because the problem itself will persist if you don't keep doing something about it. And the good news is, if you take something out, you ban something like we did with DDT and some of these other substances, now you basically, well, we still find DDT a lot, but you basically have solved a big part of the problem because you no longer have the source. or the source has been diminished quite effectively. You know, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, that got everybody's attention about DDT. And then there's ethics, which we talked about, you all talked about last week or last month. It's everything we talked about, plus some kind of measure of goodness. So you'll see in the literature, the engineering ethics literature, you'll see some concept of goodness that, okay, I can do this, but should I do it? Is it good? Is this one better? Is this technique better than that technique? Is this technology acceptable? We're running into a lot now with AI, for example. AI is just AI. So there's good parts of generational AI, and then there's dangerous parts of generational AI. That's what a lot of debate is going on, for example, right now. Is it ethical to use AI? Well, yeah, but it's also unethical, depending on how you use it. And that gets us into engineering best practices. There's 3 basic models of best practices. The minimal model, what are the standards? What are the regulations make me do? Then there's a step away from that. It's like, okay, the regulations, I see the regulations, but I'm kind of looking in the future. And even though I meet this requirement now, I can go a step further and prevent future problems. That would be sort of a reasonable care. Thinking about a lot of these engineering fictions of what would happen if a person were to, a great example was the World Trade Center, for example. Up to that point, a lot of the design requirements, we have some structural engineers here, a lot of this, and I'm not one, but a lot of design problems, talked to Henry Petrosky about that, they were, we didn't even think about intentionally running into a building, a plane flying into a building. So after 9/11, we had to start thinking about intentional accidents, which is kind of oxymoronic in a way, but that when you design something and you harden that system, and that's not just structural, that also comes in environmental, that people can humans do things that maybe you need to think a normal person wouldn't do. So you can't just have this acceptance. You can't use the mean, for example. You have to be at 2 or 3 standard deviations away from the mean if you really want to protect the system. Which brings us to the good works one, which is, okay, and this actually follows literature, psychological literature. So if you actually look at how children will become moral agents, they start with good girl, bad girl, good boy, bad girl. So you learn, you really do want to do this. You really do want to touch that radiator, but that's not a good thing to do. You're going to hurt yourself. They don't know they're going to hurt themselves when they're really young. So we keep them from doing it. So we put barriers and things like that. We do the same thing with regulations, for example, that, okay, we know it's easier to dump this stuff in the creek right now, but you're not allowed to. Okay, so don't do it. But eventually you become conventional. They call it that's pre-conventional, but you become conventional. And you do things because, okay, it's just not a good thing to do that. It's not a good thing to hurt people or make your brother touch a radiator, right? You don't feel the pain, but you should relate to the feeling of the pain. And then ultimately, there's the exemplar, the post-conventional. This was, if you're interested in that, Gilligan and Kohlberg have written extensively about how that. And I've tried in the past, I don't want to bore you with my previous presentations, but I have in the past actually used the Kohlberg model for engineers, where you start with the young the engineer that just starts. They don't want to get fired. So they may be behaving a certain way. They've been there a while. The whole point of the PE, for example, is 4 years. You work under somebody, you learn from that mentor. Then you're ready to actually be in that range, that conventional range of what it means to be a good engineer. But ultimately, you're going to be an exemplar engineer. So the other thing that bothers me a little bit, and I don't know, I should look at what you talked about last month, but a lot of times they say, well, you be the judge. You'll see this in engineering literature. We're not judges. We're agents. So we engineer by design. We basically design ourselves so we don't have an ethical problem, right? So you do the right thing. You construct a system so you don't get you don't cheat on your billable hours. Those kinds of things. Well, yeah, okay, it's not right to cheat. It's not right to cheat. Okay, I agree with that. I haven't learned anything by having that case study, but as opposed to, problems don't come to us like that. They unfold. So you need to have some kind of a defensive mechanism to help you there. And then the highest level, highest order is all of this stuff plus fairness. And that it is, some of it's codified in law. So you have to be fair. You can't have unfair hiring practices. You can't have unfair things that you can do. But a lot of it is intuitive, that as engineers and as any professional, there's things that you just shouldn't do and should do. So some of it's proscriptive, some of it's prescriptive, some of it's not allowed, some of it is you have to do. It's the highest order of ethics. So first and foremost, I want to take us back to ASCE and the code of ethics. So all of you, I'm sure, have heard the engineers must hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. That's been around since I've been involved in it in the 70s and before that. But this does characterize the need for protecting the public health, but also to be guardians for sustainability, sustaining protections into time with time. And you go, and the association has gone one step further for society, where they said we have to create resilient and sustainable infrastructures, all that this resilient stuff I talked about. We need to treat all people with respect, dignity, and fairness. And we need to consider anticipated needs. So this is a challenge. So those of you who are in education, you'll see that our accreditation boards, they really talk about this and they say it's necessary, but then they don't give us any time to do it. So you see what it takes to get an engineering degree now, with so they don't really want to add that paragraph G to it. They have it, but it's hard to justify having a student be there 5 years to get, because we don't want them to miss concrete or steel or or any of the core courses that it means to be an engineer. But at the same time, we have to figure out some way of engendering anticipated needs of society, and then equality of life, obviously, is human factors engineering. So sustainability, again, is the adhering to these principles of sustainable development. Consider this is again out of the ASCE. Balancing societal, environmental, and economic impacts, and mitigating adverse effects before they actually happen. So then doing so, if you've been involved in any kind of the green engineering or sustainable design work, where you get extra points for using local materials and things like that. LEEDs is a great example of that. That all comes from kind of that way of the ASCE's way of thinking, trying to get us to be more sustainable in our thinking. So they even changed the first canon from beyond that part where we hold paramount to safety, health, and welfare. Remember, safety's first, but we also have to strive to comply with the principles of sustainable development. I didn't add the stuff in yellow was added by ASCE. So we are risk managers. So the first question is, what is risk? It's different for each one of us. We do risk assessment constantly. Should I drive 100 miles an hour because I'm late? You didn't have to answer. But you do. It's a risk assessment. So you're thinking, and it's not only a risk for you; it's a risk for other drivers. It's risk for your family and everything else. So we constantly do risk assessment. It's informal usually, but it is the basis for most decision making we do. Whether it's your portfolio or your retirement plan or whatever, you're making risk decisions. But is it quantifiable? Well, of course it is. It does depend on whom you ask. But as I mentioned, those two first parts, hazard and exposure, it's a function of hazard and exposure. And it is a probability. So it runs from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100%. Okay, so it goes from 0 to unity. 0 being there's no risk. 100% means it's going to happen, or it's happening. And it's part of our, as I mentioned, part of our everyday lives. Unique to each one of us. So it's timely for me to say something about this. I'm not talking as a member of the government or anything like that, but we've kind of lost track, I think, a little bit of what risk assessment's all about. That you need a strong basis in science, the physical, biological, in particular sciences, to do a risk assessment. So it's this process where information is analyzed systematically, really, and to determine if there's any kind of environmental hazard that would if the exposure occurs, would lead to some unacceptable risk. That came out in 1983. It took us about 10 years to have most of the federal agencies and almost all the state agencies actually adopt that system of hazard identification, dose response, exposure assessment, and risk characterization, that stepwise how you actually get to risk. But that didn't happen automatically. It took a lot of work. So there's different processes. So one of the things that I have to remind myself of, and I'm sure you all do too, is we don't all think the same way. So we kind of all have these same steps. We identify a risk, we estimate the risk, and we evaluate the risk. But the way we generally do it in the scientific and the engineering community is we look at the physical, chemical, biological data, measurements usually, but often now I'm big on models, do a lot of models, but you have to feed the models and you have to do machine learning and so forth. It depends on good data. Then we apply deductive reasoning. Basically, we go from a general principle to a specific issue. So I'll use Newton's laws to figure out how much, or Bernoulli to figure out what's going to happen to the bend in that pipe, right, for your pipeline engineering. Then we use statistical inference. So a lot of our models are stochastic, random-based models and so forth. We do, as I mentioned, and we do exposure by looking at magnitude, frequency, and duration of that harm. And then we do cost estimation and economic cost-benefit analysis. We can't fall in love with these cost-benefit analysis like the Corps of Engineers often does. It's like, okay, I have this much flood control, I have this much water supply, therefore it's good. Well, no, not everything's monetizable. So we kind of got to be careful. But we are, I'm kind of proud of the way we do risk assessment in the scientific community. However, the people that we work for and the people that decide whether they want to fund us or not, they're not really often doing the same thing that we do in the risk assessment. They're actually, okay, I remember with this, I knew a person that she lived 110 years and she smoked every day in her life. She ate 3 dozen eggs. It's like, okay, but that's what that's not that it's not true. It's just that that's where their personal awareness is. So they're not going to, we rely on data and they rely more on awareness. And again, intuition. Now, intuition is a big part of engineering. I think that's one of the main arguments for having a young engineer work under a mentor for 4 years. There's a lot of things that you guys know that you've long since forgotten some inductive or deductive reasoning for this way this works, but it works. So in my sense, my definition of intuition is often data, information, induction, deduction that you've long since forgotten why it works, but it works. But their intuition, a lot of people you talk to, their intuition might be a lot different than that. They're like, I don't feel like I should do it. Well, that's not a very good reason. Personal experience, hey, I've always done this. I haven't died yet, type thing. And like a lot of intangible, non-monetizable things that are not quantifiable. And that's on us. We have to be better at quantifying some of those things. And finally, personality and individual action. So we are different. So a classic example, as I mentioned, dose response. This is a kind of a dose response curve. This curve has a threshold. So if you see the threshold, nothing's supposed to happen after that. We did all the data. We killed a lot of rats. We used in silico models. We did everything. So we never see anything happen below that dose. Is that where we regulate? Well, you guys as engineers, you don't do that. Well, every time we look at it, a 200-pound person can sit on the swing set and it won't fall. You don't design that way, right? You incorporate factors of safety. Well, the same thing happens in toxicokinetics and pharmacokinetics and so forth. Okay, my data all show that this is the threshold, but that's not good enough. So we have something called a reference dose that's closer to the origin. So you basically have my data all show that this is that's called that yellow arrow there is a no observable effect level threshold. However, you put that in the numerator and the denominator a bunch of uncertainty factors, and that gives us a new dose. So this reference dose is a factor of safety. And we have this for all of the including PFAS and some of these others. And that's kind of the research that we do in my computational work. So what we do is this is an example of, if you look at the blue the blue chart, it's the toxicity, it's the outcome, and the red chart's the exposure. So if I have low dose, have low hazard, excuse me, not dose, a low hazard, the blue hazard, and I have low, and there's no intersection between the hazard and the exposure. Okay, so if you basically this is looking at in vitro means a test tube type study. Okay, so we don't see anything. However, when they start intersecting, there's a little piece of it that's worrisome. So there are people out there, and a lot of times it's occupational. So there are people that might be exposed to asbestos, at a certain concentration that the rest of the population never will be. Well, OSHA doesn't regulate for the rest of the population. They should be regulating. They will regulate for that little piece. However, when you look at something from a more general standpoint, you say, okay, I looked at this compound, and every time I look at it, there's a real likelihood of exposure. It's in a lot of consumer products, and it's sufficiently toxic that I need to do something about it. I need to move that red, or that I can make it less toxic, but that's often very difficult unless you actually don't use that chemical anymore. So I have to work on exposure. So I want to move that red chart back to the left side. So acceptability in this case is an engineering connotation that gives us reliability. For me to have a reliable exposure risk reduction strategy, I have to do something to lower that exposure. So I can label it. I can find an alternative product. The life cycle analysis folks will do that. So okay, we want to get rid of palm oil. We want to use coconut oil or something like that. But oftentimes the work that we do is based on the physical, chemical, and biological, the physical sciences and biological sciences, and it's all about exposure. What can I do? So one way that you look at this is the equation for exposure is an integration of concentration with respect to time. So in other words, I have a concentration there, and if I'm in there and I'm getting this concentration, my exposure increases by that function. So how do I get that? Well, concentration is pretty easy. I mean, straightforward for a scientist. We do the measurement. We have chemical models and so forth. That DT is tough. That's where you get into psychology, activities that everybody does. How much time they spend in their car, how much time they spend in their garage, how much time they spend in the bedroom, where the pollutant is. We call it microenvironments. So one room in a house may be high concentration. The kitchen, for example, for certain contaminants, but they only spend 10 minutes there, as opposed to the kitchen where somebody spends 3 hours there. So the whole micro time and micro environment becomes very important. So yes. Oh, sorry. So basically, I said we build on this exposure assessment to characterize the risk. Then we turn it over to the risk managers like you guys, and you do things to make it less risky. And you take into things like public health considerations, social considerations, and go back to the source and say, are there some things I can do to actually reduce the source? And that would be, for example, taking something out of a product, or having a some kind of stack treatment process that lowers the concentration that goes out the stack. And we always have to consider economic factors, and so we ultimately end up with a risk management decision. So you can see this, all the orange stuff is the stuff that scientists and engineers have some control over. The yellow stuff is the stuff that the managers have to take into account and may or may not eclipse some of the science. So that's a challenge we always have. So before I finish, I want to just mention a few tools that are out there if you're interested. The first one's a chemistry dashboard, which has about 1.3 million chemicals in it right now that our group researchers have added to a lot. Then there's computational models, something called similarity indices, like quantitative chemical structure relationships, QSARs or QPARs, where you know something a lot about one compound, you don't know anything about the other compound, there's some similarities to it. We actually have tools for you to do that. So if you're looking at a compound and it looks like, there's nothing in the literature about it. Well, you may look for a similar compound that has a similar structure, for example, or similar functional groups, and say, well, wonder if I can run this QSAR model. We have QSAR models you can do that with, and they're all online. And then some work we've recently done is on machine learning with PFAS compounds. So I don't know if I can actually do this, but let me give it a shot. So,
all right, you get to change.
Okay.
Let's see.
Good. At least it came up.
Yeah.
So I think one of the best introductions to the Chem dashboard, and this is available to you. So hopefully we'll share my slides with everybody, and you can just go to that link, this isn't the only one, but there are a lot of really good NAMs, we call them, that are available to everybody. It's a public website.
Video, the US EPA's computational chemicals dashboard. These are short tutorials for individual tool features. More tooltips and longer training materials are also available to you as part of the new approach methods or NAM's training website. This tooltip will serve as a brief introduction to navigating the homepage of the dashboard, shown here. At the top, you can see the current number of included.
And you can put things like PFAS or PFOA or PFAS, and it'll recognize the acronym. TCDD, tetrachlorodibenzoyl-paradioxin, it'll recognize that. DDT, it'll recognize that.
Turn you to the current screen. To the right of the home icon is the drop-down list for search. This is where you can go to conduct either an advanced search or a batch search. To the right of this is the drop-down menu that will take you to lists of chemicals, which provides access to an chemicals associated with a project, publication, source database, or other collections, or to a list of assays. And these are the experiment endpoint names from the ToxGas type.
So the assays are the in vitro things I was talking about. So you'll see how much it's actually been studied, this chemical. So you have something like sulfur dioxide, there's tons, but something like a lot of the PFAS compounds, there might be 1 or 2 studies.
The basic search. From here, the dashboard can be searched by chemicals, product use categories, or by assay or gene. To the chemicals tab, you have the option to identify a substring search, which will change your search from a single chemical to a set of chemicals that match the search input. You can alternatively search for a chemical by product and use categories or by assay or gene by clicking the relevant tab. That's it for navigating the homepage. Thank you for accessing.
So like I said, there are actually a bunch of sites at this, the link that I'm giving you in the presentation, and I just play around with it. You can't break it. I've tried.
I'm assuming they don't give you the access to.
No, they don't let you. You can use it all you want. You just can't change any of the code.
Oh, so it's not open source, right? Like you wouldn't be able to download like a version of it and.
Oh yeah, you can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, you can download. You can work it remotely. And you can do scenario. There's a lot of scenarios. If you actually go into it, you'll see on the left side there's a bunch of tabs. So, for example, all you're really interested is exposure. There's an exposure tab, and then you can do different scenarios of how it'll pull in other data like the CPDAT, which is the Consumer Product Database that was developed about 10 years ago, and it's been updated to CPCAT. Those have like not just the chemical, but they have where the chemical is. So you may say it's in shampoo, or it's in pipeline oils or something, And you can actually find, it may not be that quite that specific, but some system, some chemical mixture you work with, it may have that it'll link the chemical compound to the product. And they're not just consumer products, although consumer products is very heavy in consumer products. But you might be interested in that. No, not a problem. So again, this has been in development for a long time. It's had changed a few names. It used to be called CompTox data, CompTox dashboard. There you go. Thank you. And she mentioned the quantitative structure activity relationship. They're there too on the left side. You can go to the QSARs and QPARs, and there's actually a new one, relatively new to me, 10 years, but it looks at function. So say, for example, you really just want to look at plasticizers. Okay. So you can actually look at chemical compounds by function, which is kind of good because a lot of times that's how we're exposed. Most of the work right now in modeling are stochastic models, the stochastic human exposure and dose simulation, SHEDS. HT stands for high throughput. And a few years ago, we only used SHEDS for pesticides, generally multimedia. We called it multimedia to look at all the different ways that you could be exposed. Well, now we can look at multiple chemicals, and that's a pretty cool study. I mean, pretty cool model. Basically, what you do is you take your input data, and you put some algorithms together to build what we call a virtual population. So I may have information about one person, but I turn it into 10,000. And then I get some kind of an output. Here we basically, I can do it for multiple chemicals. I could actually say, well, wow, there's a set of chemicals that really have a lot of potential risk because I have both exposure and hazard associated with them.
Does it look at any sort of like interaction between chemicals?
Yes, it does. Okay. But that's a major problem. I mean, we have so little information on mixtures and synergy, but we tried, there's literature out there for looking at synergistic effects, and synergistic exposure is pretty easy but again, easy in the sense to write the model, not easy to actually have good data for it.
Yeah, to have all the interactions.
Yeah, right. So like each one of those microenvironments, you spend a certain amount of time. So actually, when I look at exposure, I start with that first equation I showed you, but then I do that equation for each microenvironment over a 24-hour period. So I might have a sum of 25 different microenvironments for that particular person. I could take that and just plug it into this module system, and now I actually have a much more robust type of exposure scenario.
Because it might be someone that like has multiple areas where they're considered at risk. Like, oh, there's someone who has to commute a long way to work, and then their work where they're at, they're working with metals, and it's like a large.
Exactly. Well, see, that you got two problems there, because we don't know a lot about metals. It's really funny if you actually look at, at times I was like, okay, we should know a lot about monomethyl mercury, right? Don't I have some kind of a toxicity? No, it's really hard to find anything. We just know it's bad, right? Right, because metals speciate, and so you could do total, and a lot of times what we do is total cobalt or total mercury or so forth. But a lot of times it's the particular speciation that determines the toxicity and the likelihood of exposure. So, say for mercury, for example, you end up with a lot of monomethyl mercury in a fish, and a lot more in the fish liver. So, but the fish was probably exposed to elemental mercury. They came out of a stack or something, right? So it deposits into the water, and then the fish gets it, and then they metabolize it. So we have a lot of, I keep saying toxicokinetics or pharmacokinetics. Basically, all that is, the acronym is ADME: absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination or excretion. So something comes into the organism, it has to be absorbed. It can be around you, but it doesn't, if you don't breathe the air where it is, it doesn't make it to your interface of your mouth, you're not going to be exposed. So it's there, it may be there, but I'm not being particularly exposed. This comes into effect a lot in occupational, where they have personal protective equipment. it's there, but it's not making it through the respirator. But when they take the respirator off, it's super high dose. And unfortunately, a lot of workers don't abide by, I've heard of cases where they make holes in their masks and boilers to smoke their cigarette while they're, that kind of defeats the PPE. But yeah, that's a really good question. The other part of that, in addition to metals, or you'll find metals in here, but it's really, compared to the organics, it's almost everything is organic. But the synergy is super important, and mixtures are super important. And go online anytime, and you'll see any kind of conference on environmental whatever, you're going to see something about mixtures. That's like, well, we need to do more. Yeah, absolutely. But that is a hugely important, but a highly uncertain thing. So here's just basically the SHEDS HT run, if you're interested in how it's structured. So basically, all I've been talking about, all these data, different kind of data that we have. Ultimately, we make a population. We look at how they're exposed. We get a lot of the stuff from HUD, for example, on housing characteristics and so forth. We look at the activities that I've been talking about, all these different microenvironmental activities. There's an exposure factors handbook, which actually is woefully in need of update. 2011 was the last official. I think in 2019 we've updated some chapters, but exposure factors handbook. What's a 90th percentile exposure for a child to arsenic, for example? That's in the handbook. But ultimately, we end up with that risk profile. So machine learning, I just wanted to mention, we're doing this kind of stuff with PFAS. PFAS, every chemical we look at something called fraction unbound, what makes it into the blood, so forth. And that, again, if you absorbed it, but it's got a high fraction bound, it's going to stay. Your body burden is going to go up in time. But if it's got a lot of fraction unbound, your E is going to increase, your excretion is going to increase, and it's going to get out of the body. So you may just have an equilibrium of what your body burden over time, maybe low, but it can go high if the fraction unbound. So one of the things we did with PFAS is say, okay, we have some pretty good information on toxicokinetics. We're going to put a machine learning model based on this structural property relationship I talked about, compare it to other things, and then extend the knowledge. We trained the set with 20 compounds. There's like 4,000 out there. And we actually ran the model. We did the test run with 80. So we had 100 PFAS compounds we looked at. And again, how big is my domain of applicability? So what can those 100 compounds, the 20 in my training set and my test set of 80, what kind of compounds can I actually say something about? And there you have to be humble. So, it may be that it's only a few other hundred. It's not the full 4,000 or 12,000 or however they're counting anything that has a fluorine in it. It seems like they're counting as PFAS compounds. So basically conclusions are, that's our job, is to reduce risks. I'm optimistic. I think we have some great tools and things out there. We have to be humble and careful with them, but they're out there. There's a lot of them. They're very user friendly now. I joke that a lot of times I don't learn how my student service contractors and so forth write the code, because it's going to be a different code tomorrow. So I'll let them write it and use it. That hire somebody, hire them back again to update the code. But basically, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of tools out there. Computational among all. I think that's the trend. A lot of the federal agencies don't do observational studies anymore on a lot of these things. We use other people's data, something called systematic review and evidence mapping in medicine and environmental engineering. Those are hugely important tools right now. So thank you for listening.
I have a comment. It seems to me that if you look over history, we as a society have spent much more time on testing drugs for safety than anything else. I happened to invest in a drug one time in the development of the drug, and the researchers worked on 10 years. 10 years to evaluate its safety. And in 10 years, it was very safe. The problem was the drug didn't work. All the effort.
Yeah.
Nobody ever stopped to ask, well, does the drug work?
Yeah.
It turned out no big drug company followed the drug for that reason. If you look over the years, like forever chemicals, some of the pesticides like DDT, my dad used that, it worked great in this section, was
Sure.
really the way it worked.
Yeah.
And so people through the years have, unless it's a drug that you ingest, very little effort was.
Yeah.
Very little effort, so, and that's why we ended up with the polyfluoroalkyl situation, the pesticides, forever chemicals.
Yeah.
And so your work, it appears to me, is working on stuff that through history, nobody ever really worked on.
Yeah, no, you're making a lot of good points. One of them is when I was in the lab doing a lot of lab work, we required Teflon because it was non-reactive. So a lot of our labs have a lot of PFAS in them because Teflon is a PFAS compound.
Now,
But I think your other point is really well taken too, because now I'm on an institutional review board at Duke Medicine, right? And there are different steps. Like you have the first stage of testing would be what efficacy, whether it's effective, whether it works, so first in human study. So we'll get them after the animal studies, for example. Does it actually work? So cancer treatment drugs and so forth. But then there's safety. It comes after that. So you basically, you don't quit looking for efficaciousness, but you also have to go to the next step. Okay, it looks like it's pretty efficacious. It looks like it's working, but is it safe? And then ultimately you go through all these trials. A lot of them are sponsored by the drug companies, but they're done by the universities. So you have like multi-sites. But I'm not saying what you're saying isn't true. Yeah, that's true. That you may make something. I think it was Aquinas that said, if the captain cared about the safety of his crew, he'd never leave port. So you do have to say, and that's why that you'll actually see that risk management doesn't just have hardcore science that the decision. So the assessment should be hardcore science, but the management and reduction strategies need to include all the things you're talking about too, efficaciousness in particular.
Federal government de-emphasized in the testing of forever chemicals.
I haven't heard that.
Yeah, I saw that.
I hope. Well, it may be. I mean, they may, again, but
Really fast.
well, we have a handful of PFAS compounds where we do have standards now, like maximum contaminant levels for drinking water at 2 parts per trillion.
And you also
Or
have,
4 parts per
and
trillion.
then you also have enforcement of those, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the enforcement actually is at more state level than the federal level. So the feds actually kind of come up with the standards, but the implementation.
Maybe that's what it's about. It's something about the emphasis on forever chemicals. I read that for about 2 days ago.
I
didn't read the article, but
I wouldn't doubt that there are other factors that go into, I can't talk about that, but that's not really my area of expertise, but I know there's a whole nother venue and a whole nother domain out there, political, ideological, economic, all those kinds of things that I know less than you do about it. So, but I'm sure that it's discussed. Like, are we spending too much time worrying about things that there's like my graphs? They're not even going to come close. The potential exposure is not even going to be there. You're worried about something as opposed to something like Gen X, where it is in the water. You go to a lot of water bodies in North Carolina, you're going to find Gen X and PFAS and PFAS and PFOA. So they're out there. But
it's harder too, because it's not like with the drug where you're purposely dosing and ingesting a certain amount. Certain people are getting different amounts. It's all in if it's in the water supply or what.
Yeah.
So you're having to do a lot more legwork and trying to figure out what's getting.
Yeah. So you do have some similarities at the beginning where you do the same kind of thing, just see, well, we're going to dose at these levels with animals, and in vitro is basically, we're not even using animals. We're using basically other assays with different kind of catalysts and so forth. But Yeah, you're right. Then now they have this little data set, how do I use it? And so you plug it into models and things like that, which could be some of the discussion. It's okay, if we have good enough, when are they good enough? And can we just have a model? And we are trying to work on this. Come up with some machine learning and things like that, okay, I have a little bit of data. How can I extend that knowledge to things I don't know? That's always the challenge, is the known, the unknown, the unknown unknowns. The known knowns are easy, but the unknown knowns and the known unknowns, so.
I guess for another question would be, so how much have you been seeing any sort of change in terms of the amount of funding or the data being shared or available? Like, I remember wondering about like some of these tools that are and research available to the public. Has there been any changes to that or anything?
Not yet,
Okay.
but we have heard things that it's going to be, I think there'll be less emphasis on, non-applied research. And that's not relative, that's relatively old. I mean, most everything the federal government does is applied research. And the states are more application of the applied research to state needs. And locals are the ones that actually collect the water and see how do I get down to 4 parts per trillion? So they have to send it to a contract line and so forth. So there's this federalism involved in what you're talking about. And
You're saying individuals can also get involved if they
yes,
want, like water
yes.
collection, sample collection. I know that was
Yeah.
thinking with lead sampling for drinking water. So
Yeah, and there are like some of the environmental groups and so forth. If you go on site and they're concerned about a particular chemical compound, they'll do all of the work. You just have to follow some kind of protocol for collecting the sample, air, water, soil, whatever, and then they'll define it. The extension agents, NC State, they'll look at a lot of things. Not some of these esoteric things, but a lot of things you worry about. So they'll do testing for you. So yeah, right. And that is the ideal, is you can't have the federal government do everything. You do want to have, a handoff for these tools, or the universities for that matter. I mean, they do the studies, but then you want something to be done with the studies. So the studies have to be, one of the biggest challenges I have with doing systematic reviews and evidence mapping is metadata. A lot of times there'll be good data out there, but the data are irrelevant, or they were collected in a way that I can't use them. So or they may be good, but they didn't do a good job articulating what the metadata are. Why were they collected? When was it collected? How were they handled? Did they use preservatives? Absolutely. Absolutely.
If there was some other thing that was really effective.
And that's a huge challenge. So there may be data out there, but you can't use them in the way you want to use them because they were collected in a way that and no shame on them, they did it for a particular reason. But we'd love to go to, we go to peer-reviewed literature first. And the next thing you have to look is relevance. So is it quality? The quality is fine, accuracy, precision, but it's not relevant. Yeah.
One question out of ignorance. Several times on the screen, you had chemical structural relationships. I'm not in environmental field, but I've been in solid structure mechanics for over 60 years.
Yeah, different kind of structure. So if you look at a molecule. Yes, it's a molecule. So you could have, let's take benzene, for example, which is a ring of carbons with hydrogens at each one of the 6 rings. So I have 6 points in there. Yeah, so I may have toluene where I put a methyl group on it, or I may have phenol where I put an OH group on it. So but I may have something where I chlorinate it. So I may have a lot of data on a dichlorinated benzene, but I don't have any data on a tri or a per chlorinated benzene. So I can take what I know about the di, and I'm making this up. So, but an example would be I can take what I know about the dichlorobenzene and apply it to these other maybe multi-ring structures. But that's what that's why they call them similarity models, because I'm looking for similarities. I'm saying, oh, but it's very different because I have I look at dioxin, it's got a couple of oxygen bonds between the benzene rings, which makes it really, really persistent and really, really toxic, right? So I can't really apply benzene to that, but maybe I can apply a single type of that has an oxygen group on it. And so my model actually says, so here's how far you can go with the data and say, okay, you can say it's likely to be, and then we look at what we call partitioning coefficients. It's likely to be lipophilic. It really likes fat, or it's hydrophilic. It's a polar compound. It really loves, it's going to dissolve in water immediately. You can say things like that based on your, based on structure, the molecular structure. I should have known that. Yeah. When I say structure to you guys, it means something different to a lot of you, but yeah. So it's the structure of the molecule.
All it's happening with federal funding. Has civil engineering been hit at Duke? I know it has been at NC State.
Yeah. I don't know if civil engineering specifically has, but I'm not the right person to ask. Ask Henry Gavin. But I imagine it does. Everybody's in an austere climate right now.
I think over 2 million, but that's small compared to places like Harvard and Columbia, but I think it's over 2 million just in civil engineering at NC State has been frozen.
Yeah, that's
So it's come from
a lot.
probably EPA and NSA.
That's a lot. Yeah, it's happening. And I know it's happening at Duke. I get the emails that tells us, you know, new travel restrictions and things like that, but I'm adjunct, so it doesn't affect me. No, I'm environmental. My master's from Kansas was civil environmental with environmental health studies emphasis, and then my PhD is civil environmental, but really environmental. You don't want me designing anything.
All about chemistry.
Well, you kind of have to. Like, you kind of have to. And maybe I don't know as much as you think I do. Because I work with some very brilliant computational chemists, and they would say, you're an engineer, you're not a chemist, which I take as a compliment. So my son says I'm an engineering scientist. He's a real engineer. So if you want somebody to design something, hire him, but you don't want me anywhere near a design. Thank you for the compliment, though.
I didn't see any more
Okay,
questions online.
these are great questions.
Yeah, there were people asking about Risk Management Association and more information. Someone posted about there's a Society for Risk Analysis, SRA.org.
SRA, right. I've given a few presentations in them. They're
And
really
then
good.
USAID
They're very eclectic,
also
though.
has
They're not-
stuff.
They include things like actuarial sciences and everything, any kind of risk. If you look at ISO definitions, there's like 50 different definitions of risk. So that's why I thought when I originally sent you guys something, I said I probably need to say something at the beginning because risk could be so many different things to so many different people. So that's why I laid out the cascade. Yeah, SRA is good. The International Society for Exposure Science is good. International Society for Environmental Epidemiology, ISEE, is good. There's some really good groups out there. So the EPI group, obviously, they look at human populations and so forth. The ISES, International Society of Exposure Science, looks at all the things I talked about: likelihood of exposure, all the different pathways, inhalation, dermal, ingestion. That's their expertise. Yeah, there's some good groups out there. Okay, well, thank you all. Appreciate it.
We'll send an email out about PDHs and then what the presentation for next month.